The American Revolution, the Great American Tax Dodge. It inspired many other revolutions, most famously the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, and indeed the revolutions that rocked Europe in 1848. But the American Revolution, far from being unique, was also inspired by two particular other revolutions whose role in inspiring the Americans to revolt in 1776 I'd like to look at today. And the first of those is the Dutch Revolt. The Dutch Revolt, also known as the start of the 80 Years' War, occurred in 1566. And the Dutch Revolt is important because it has a lot of similarities with the American Revolution. For one, it's in a context of a part of a much wider globe-spanning empire revolting against a monarch and overthrowing that monarch. In the case of the Dutch Revolt, this was against the Spanish Empire led by King Philip II. As a result of being part of this global empire, the Netherlands was heavily taxed at the time in order to pay for Spain's armies that were fighting several wars in different places at the same time. The Dutch noblemen, in order to try and change the situation, petitioned the king, and when the king refused to enact any changes, civil disobedience flared up. One difference is that there was a very particular religious element in the Dutch Revolt, in particular that of Protestants who were cracked down on by Spanish authorities as a result of the Counter-Reformation. But at the same time, these civil disobedience then led to the formation of militias and armies that fought against Spanish forces and eventually led in 1581 to the Plakkaat van Verlatingen, also known in English as the Act of Abjuration. Essentially, this was the Dutch Declaration of Independence, declaring that the states, which in 1588 came together to form a new nation known as the Dutch Republic or the United Provinces, these states came together to reject the authority and the legitimacy of the Spanish monarch ruling over this nation and instead declared themselves to be a republic. These states had joined together in the Union of Utrecht and so formed really a model for the United States in many ways. It was the first secession from a major European empire. The United States was the second, almost exactly 2 centuries later. In the process of creating the Dutch Republic, the Dutch developed a theory of legitimate revolt, instituted contract-based federal governance, reinvented both the theory and practice of republican rule, and promoted religious tolerance. These achievements took place more than half a century before Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau put their pens to paper to articulate theories of the social contract and toleration. This is taken from America's Neglected Debt to the Dutch, an institutional perspective by Roger D. Congleton, which I'll link in the description below and is an interesting read for looking at the parallels between these two world events. Particularly the Act of Abjuration from 1581 is interesting to contrast with the Articles of Confederation from 1778, as they espouse many of the same principles and ideas, that monarchs ruling over a people through tyranny can lose their legitimacy. This is something that is still reflected in that Dutch anthem that I play so often when we sing that the King of Spain has been honoured. Another interesting parallel is the role of the stadhouder, which in the Dutch system was both a civil ruler as well as an important figurehead during times of military crisis, and this is quite similar to, of course, the role that the president would end up taking in the American system. There's also the effect of press freedom in the newly established Dutch Republic, as in many places there was tight control over what could be published, particularly in religious as well as in political circles. However, the fact that the Dutch Republic for a long time enjoyed relative press freedom meant that many philosophers, including René Descartes, were able to publish in the Netherlands instead, and that there was a limited amount of religious toleration and the toleration of new ideas being allowed to spread and develop after being published in the Netherlands. This would of course be important for one group that would come from England and that are very well known to Americans, the Puritans. And they are a nice bridge to the second of the revolutions that influenced the American Revolution, the English Revolution. Now, the English Revolution isn't really a term that is very well known. Most people might be wondering, well, what date was the English Revolution? Well, the American Revolution is globally recognized. But really, the English Revolution could be dated back to 1642, a year in which England and indeed other nations in Britain and Ireland would go to war with one another. This wasn't a simple civil war, however. It would pit king and parliament against one another. The king at the time, Charles I, also heavily taxed his people, and this was largely seen as illegitimate. Given that he was unable to work together with parliament, he did so through forced decrees and forced loans. And again, we see an interesting parallel with the American cause, who also claimed that taxation upon them was unjust. The nations of England, Scotland and Ireland split, with some supporting Parliament and some supporting the king. However, at this point, even those in the parliamentarian camp weren't true Republicans, apart from a few radicals. They only wanted to defeat the king in order to change the system. This English Civil War, or the War of the Three Kingdoms, as it's sometimes known, is important though, because while that's how it started, that of course isn't how it ended. And part of the reason why this radical strand was able to develop and eventually take over the parliamentarian side of the conflict lies in the 1644 development of the new model army. This being an army that was based on merit rather than on pedigree and background, as had been the case beforehand. These also brought soldiers from various religious, and by religious I mean Protestant, backgrounds together, including not just those following the National Anglican Church, but also independents, religious independents, Congregationalists, and other types of Protestants, Puritans, etc. And so the idea of religious toleration was born in this army, as they were fighting cheek by jowl with others of different Protestant denominations against the king. They also militarily proved to be incredibly effective. Hey, that's what you get when you give meritocracy a chance, I suppose. And they were soon able to defeat the forces of the king and take the king into captivity. However, in the summer of 1646 and going into 1647, elements of the new model army would rebel against their commanders. These rebels would disparagingly be known as the Levelers by their opponents, and as well as those producing Republican pamphlets in London, they would produce the Agreement of the People to put their demands forward to the grandees, or the heads of the army, the generals, including Sir Oliver Cromwell.
Cromwell. I hear nothing but Cromwell, Cromwell.
And it's important to read the start of this Agreement of the People because it sounds very familiar to another important document that would be written in the United States over a century later. We, the free people of England, to whom God hath given hearts, means, and opportunity to effect the same, do with submission to his wisdom, in his name, and desiring the equity thereof, may be to his praise and glory, agree to ascertain our government to abolish all arbitrary power, and to set bounds and limits both to our supreme and all subordinate authority, and remove all known grievances. This is an important document, and it was in part penned by John Lilburne. And John Lilburne is very important as a figure among the Levelers. He'd already been imprisoned and mutilated by Charles, and would once again be imprisoned by Parliament in these years, because he was a big inspiration for Thomas Jefferson. And in fact, as well as just being an inspiration, it seems that Thomas Jefferson was actually a descendant of John Lilburne. And he had two people in his direct family who would be named Lilburne as a reference to this individual, which is quite interesting. Actually, a slight tangent, I also discovered through doing this research that John Lilburne was from Sunderland, so I guess he would have said something like, "We's free people of these." Anyway, I'll not do any more of me Maxim. But essentially, John Lilburne had been a soldier in the New Model Army and became a radical who produced various pamphlets like the Agreement of the People. Now, these radical men of the rank and file would meet with their army commanders in a series of debates at Putney, called the Putney Debates, where they would put forward their petition to the commanders to try and hammer out an agreement. This largely started by looking at arrears in pay and the fears that many soldiers had that they would be shipped off to fight in Ireland without actually being paid for having fought and won the Civil War. But when it came to it, actually, they brought forward radical social and legal changes. They were headed in these debates by Thomas Rainsborough.
You grant us what remains of this blessed day to pray together, Colonel Rainsborough?
No, sir. You blaspheme by giving the Son of God a birthday party. This is a day like any other.
You were too hot.
And part of his speech, which were recorded in the minutes of his meeting with Oliver Cromwell and Sir Henry Ireton, have been recorded and have become rather famous as a result. And again, they sound a little bit familiar to things that we'll find later on in America. For really, I think that the poorest he that is in England hath a life to live as the greatest he, and therefore truly, sir, I think it clear that every man that is to live under a government ought first by his own consent to put himself under that government. And I do think that the poorest man in England is not at all bound in a strict sense to that government that he hath not had a voice to put himself under. They essentially were calling for more frequent elections, universal male suffrage, freedom of worship, some for only Protestants, some for all Christians, and some, the most radical, for everyone. An end to conscription, no taxation without representation, freedom of trade, reform of the legal system, and trial by jury. It's fair to say that both Cromwell and Ireton were horrified by these demands. This was unthinkable at the time, and this was the side that had been perceived as radical for fighting against their own king. Ultimately, the Levellers were unsuccessful. They did not manage to get this enshrined into British law, but it did sort of mark a point at which the horse was out of the gate. And in 1648, Sir Thomas Rainsborough was killed by royalists in a kidnapping attempt. And it's interesting that then his brother, Sir William Rainsborough, had as his cornet, his symbol, Salus Populi Suprema Lex. And this became a very important legal idea at the time, as it means let the good of the people be the supreme law. And this, of course, is again something that we will see later on in America. He also had on his coat of arms the severed head of King Charles I, and that did indeed transpire. In 1649, the king, following a second bout of civil war, was put on trial, found guilty, and executed. This would lead to the creation of an English republic. And so we can see again similarities here. This wouldn't last though, as in 1660, following Oliver Cromwell's death after he'd taken the reins of power for himself into a protectorate, the son of the executed king would come and reinstate the monarchy. However, it's still important because these events were part of the backdrop to several scholars of the English Enlightenment, most notably John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, whose writings certainly inspired the founding fathers in the United States and provided something of the ideological and philosophical background for the ideals of liberty and fraternity that would be so important for the Americans. Another important event would be the 1688 Glorious Revolution, in which the son of the new king, Charles II, this is James II, would be removed from the throne after once again proving to be rather tyrannical as a ruler, and he would be replaced by the Dutch Stadthouder Willem, who then became William III of England. This is important because he would sign the Bill of Rights, which would essentially make England, Scotland and Ireland into a constitutional monarchy, giving it a constitution which limited the power of the monarch and enshrined what was allowed in that law of the people for a king to do and not to do. But I won't discuss that in this video. It's getting a little bit long. I suppose this is sort of less of a bottom-up revolution than the others in some ways. And I've also spoken about 1688, the Glorious Revolution, in this video. But let me know what you think in the comments below. I appreciate you taking the time to watch the video. I mean, happy 250th birthday to our American viewers of the channel. And I will hopefully see you all in the next video. Thanks to the patrons. Help me out if you can, and see you soon.